Cinema has a strange relationship with time. The cinematic image feels present. You're witnessing something happen right now, before your eyes. Some films use the immediacy of cinema to great effect, to make you feel like you are watching a story unfold spontaneously, as though you are in the same room as the characters. But cinema can also be a means of embalming time and allowing the past to persist. Sometimes when watching a film, you cannot help but feel the gulf of time that exists between the moment the image was recorded and the moment that you are experiencing it. V.F. Perkins once wrote that recording fixes sights, sounds, and segments of living time, so they can be brought out and replayed at will. Every time you return to a film, it unfolds the exact same way. Your perceptions may change, but the images and characters never do. The figures on screen are like ghosts, spirits of the dead, apparitions made out of light, blessed to relive the same triumphs, doomed to repeat the same mistakes. As French philosopher Jacques Derrida claimed,
le cinéma est un art, une fantomachie si vous voulez. Et je crois que le cinéma, quand on ne s'y ennuie pas, c'est ça. C'est un art de laisser revenir les fantômes. Alors c'est ce que nous faisons ici.
To my mind, no film has ever reflected this aspect of cinema as poignantly as the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. The film is about Robert Ford, an obsessive fan of the legendary outlaw Jesse James.
I'm an authority on the James boys.
Is you?
He joins the James gang just as it's heading towards dissolution, and Jesse is being consumed by paranoia and resentment. Now a shadow of his former self, Jesse James spends his days planning robberies that will never be committed, whilst tormenting, threatening, and sometimes even murdering the few hangers-on he has left. Ford, now fearful for his life and resentful of the way his hero has failed to live up to his image, murders Jesse, and then must live out the rest of his life branded a coward, a villain, and a traitor. What makes this film a masterpiece is that it doesn't try to tell us this story in the present tense. It doesn't try to generate tension or suspense in the traditional way such a film might, or make us wonder what will come next. Instead, it tells us, over and over again, that the events on screen have already taken place. They are fixed in time. And it invites us to watch them being reenacted, with a sense of melancholy detachment. The film's voiceover, provided in the third person by a seemingly omniscient narrator, frequently mentions things that have not happened yet.
Alexander Franklin James would be in Baltimore when he would read of the assassination of Jesse James.
And sometimes even things that won't occur until after the events depicted in the film.
Edward O'Kelly would be ordered to serve a life sentence in the Colorado Penitentiary for second-degree murder.
Many shots have a hazy vignette around the edges of the frame, and the colour palette is filled with desaturated yellows and browns, which lend the images a sepia tone, and so it can feel as though you are looking at an old photograph that's been brought to life. Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck's performances have a sense of profound sadness to them, which sometimes jars with the characters' violent and immature behaviour. It's as if the main characters of the film are not Jesse James and Robert Ford themselves, but rather the ghostly after-images of them, the historical residue they left behind after death. Somehow they have gradually attained an awareness that they are stuck in an endlessly recurring dream, forced to repeat the actions that they regret the most.
want is to enter my house justified.
Hello and welcome to The Road to Contention, a series about westerns. Today we are going to talk about the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford in the context of the western genre, and explore how it, like all westerns, is a ghost story of sorts. The western, perhaps more than any other genre, is tied to the past. Its heroes were often once real people who have long since died, only for the events of their lives to be reenacted and replayed by phantoms made of light. In some sense, the western has long been haunted.
Last, it was a ghost town. And that's what you are, Doc, a ghost. You've outlived your kind and you've outlived your time, and I'm coming to get you.
The western is innately bound to the events of a bygone era, the expansion of the American frontier in the late 19th century. Of course, the western has always provided a deeply distorted view of this history, partly just as a means of exciting viewers with archetypal mythic stories of larger-than-life figures, brave heroes and evil villains who engage in violent, dramatic conflicts. Yet, there is also a political dimension to the way this history has been distorted to reflect a particular idea of America's origins.
This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
By examining the genre now, we find ourselves confronted by certain ideas that still haunt America to this day.
They call me Jesse James.
I'm sitting in a rocking chair chatting with none other than Jesse James.
What's the key to him? What makes him Jesse James?
We can see this very clearly by taking a look at the figure of Jesse James, who he was, how his myth was established, and how he was depicted in the movies. Jesse James is often thought of as an outlaw from the Wild West, like Butch Cassidy or Billy the Kid, although Jesse himself identified far more with the American South.
Those Yankee farmers won't stop their killing. Missouri's a southern state. We were here first.
He was born in 1847 in Missouri, a slave state. The James family owned around 6 or 7 human beings for most of Jesse's childhood and adolescence. They bought and sold children. The Civil War broke out when Jesse was a teenager. The southern states wanted to expand and maintain the institution of slavery, but faced opposition from the North, and so seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. Jesse's family wanted to keep their slaves, and as such, they were strongly in favor of the Confederacy.
Where's your son, Frank?
Where he should be, fighting for the South.
Jesse's elder brother Frank went to fight for the Confederate forces. However, early in the war, the Union Army took control of the state, and Frank returned home. Frank and Jesse would then join with the guerrilla companies that formed to fight back against the Union through terroristic acts committed behind enemy lines. Unlike the large battlefields with rows of men wielding muskets that likely come to mind when thinking about the American Civil War, the guerrillas generally fought in smaller skirmishes on horseback, and their weapon of choice was the revolver. The American Civil War was a violent, bloody conflict, and there were many atrocities committed on both sides. But the Confederate guerrilla troops were especially known for their brutality, often executing men who had surrendered to them, conducting massacres in which children were murdered, and mutilating the corpses of those they killed. Frank and Jesse served under one of the most notorious guerrilla commanders, Bloody Bill Anderson.
This is my second in command, Mr. Anderson.
Anderson once reportedly raped a 12-year-old girl and tortured a man by slicing off his ears whilst he was still alive. Jesse James was with Anderson's men when they committed the infamous Centralia massacre, and he fought in the subsequent Battle of Centralia.
This is one of the ultimate atrocities of the Civil War. 100 and some men, helpless, disarmed, murdered in their tracks. Beheadings, disembowelments, torture, fiendish torture, men begging for their lives.
Accounts say that there was not a a corpse on that field that had the same head on it that it started the day with.
In one case, a man's privates were described as being cut off and shoved in the man's mouth. And there were scalps taken, there were other acts of mutilation.
War's over, son. General Lee surrendered yesterday at Appomattox.
After the Union ultimately triumphed in the Civil War, there came the Reconstruction era, during which there was a lot of conflict over what form post-war American society would take. Would African Americans, now freed from bondage, have political rights and be granted some wealth and land in compensation for their suffering and exploitation? Or would slave owners be able to hold on to their wealth, land, and power, effectively meaning that slavery would continue in all but name? Many former Confederate soldiers and sympathizers committed acts of violence in order to further their political agenda and spread terror amongst their enemies, the Ku Klux Klan being the most notorious example. Likewise, many former guerrilla soldiers would continue the same nomadic, violent lifestyles they'd had during the war, becoming bandits.
Who runs this place? I do.
These outlaws started committing a relatively new type of crime, the bank holdup.
We were raiders, and we're gonna do some raiding again.
Pardon me, ma'am?
Whilst people certainly had stolen from banks prior to this point, it was often through fraud or stealth. Daytime armed robberies like this hadn't really been seen before. It's not known when exactly Jesse James began participating in such crimes, but the first he is widely believed to have committed was a bank robbery in Gallatin, Missouri, where he allegedly murdered the bank teller, falsely believing that he'd been the man who'd killed Bloody Bill Anderson during the war.
God damn it, Jess, I said no bloodshed.
Jesse and Frank James then joined with the Younger brothers and other former guerrillas to form the James Younger Gang, robbing banks in Missouri and the surrounding states. They would also rob trains by stopping them on the tracks and holding both crew and passengers hostage, again a type of crime that was fairly new at this point.
Stop the train.
Why?
I'm robbing it.
No one's ever robbed a moving train.
These crimes were explicitly political.
Either you men fight for the stars and bars?
The gang called out the names of Confederate soldiers they wished to avenge, and even wore Klan hoods to one robbery. Some historians have claimed that the James Younger Gang are better understood as terrorists rather than simply thieves.
Roy, stop the press. Take a new editorial on railroad presidents.
From early on, the gang's crimes caught the attention of newspaperman John Newman Edwards, a Confederate veteran who met with Jesse James and worked on a series of articles about the gang, perhaps with the cooperation of Jesse himself. These articles would celebrate the gang and their crimes, whilst paradoxically often still proclaiming their innocence. One of the articles, entitled The Chivalry of Crime, mythologized the James Younger Gang, comparing them directly to the Knights of the Round Table. Whilst Jesse James was not necessarily the leader of the gang, Edwards clearly saw him as the most saleable of the bunch due to his eloquence, youth, and charisma, so he would single Jesse out in his articles. Meanwhile, Jesse himself would also write letters, which were published in various newspapers. Throughout history, many cultures have elevated certain criminals and bandits to the status of folk heroes, because they seem to represent resistance to injustice, struggling on behalf of common people against their oppressors. Robin Hood perhaps being the most famous example.
It's time we put an end to this. Robin fight!
Through their articles and letters, Jesse and Edwards self-consciously drew upon these myths to create for the gang a Robin Hood image.
This one about his being like Robin Hood. This is a good one.
They were cast as brave champions of the working man, conducting their crimes in a noble, chivalrous manner.
You a farmer? Keep.
Striking back at the evil Yankee banks and railroad companies that sought to exploit Southerners. A letter to the newspaper from a member of the gang, likely Jesse himself, claimed, "We rob the rich and give to the poor." However, there seems to be no evidence they ever gave the proceeds of their crime to the poor, and they would frequently gun down unarmed, innocent people during their robberies. Soon the James Younger Gang, and Jesse in particular, would become famous throughout America. National newspapers would report on their deeds. The express companies, whom the James Younger Gang robbed, hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to catch them. The Pinkertons blew up the James brothers' family home. Killing Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother and blowing off his mother's arm. This act provoked widespread sympathy for the James Younger Gang, even amongst those who disapproved of their crimes.
Killing a simple-minded boy. You men did an excellent job of making heroes out of every one of those gentlemen.
It helped solidify the narrative created by Jesse and John Newman Edwards that the James brothers were victims of northern persecution, and their robberies were a means of fighting back. There was now a desire to grant Frank and Jesse a fair trial,
We find the defendant not guilty as charged.
one they would likely walk away from freely if they had a sympathetic judge and jury.
Amnesty! The governor's being asked to grant amnesty to you both.
Jesse, however, did not want to give up. The gang decided to head north and commit their next raid behind enemy lines, choosing as their target the First National Bank of Northfield, Minnesota.
Hands in the air! They're robbing this bank! Help! Robbers! Oh! They're robbing the bank!
It was a disaster. The citizens of the town saw the robbery in progress and took up arms, killing 2 members of the gang. Jesse and Frank were the only ones who managed to get away, and this fact only added to their legend. Frank and Jesse then retired from crime for a while, living peacefully with their wives and children under assumed names.
Gentlemen, this is my brother-in-law, John D. Howard.
However, Jesse soon gambled his money away and became restless. He recruited a new gang, composed of inexperienced men. By this point, the political project Jesse had been fighting for was largely a success. The former Confederates had regained political power across most of the South. They were able to undo much of the progressive legislation that granted rights to freed slaves, ensuring that America would continue to be a firmly white supremacist nation for generations to come. This meant that Jesse's violence was no longer needed, and now his robberies were starting to reflect poorly on politicians, making them seem soft on crime. Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden is rumored to have essentially arranged Jesse's assassination, offering Robert Ford, a young member of the gang, a large reward and a pardon in exchange for doing the deed.
I'll give you Jesse James.
$15,000. Half before and half when it's done.
Got yourself a deal.
On April 3rd, 1882, Robert Ford shot Jesse James in the back of the head whilst he was dusting a picture in his home.
I shot Jesse James.
After his death, Jesse's fame only grew. Multiple plays were staged, telling his story to packed theatres throughout the country, including a show starring Robert Ford entitled How I Killed Jesse James.
behind the ear and he fell like a log.
And that's how I killed Jesse James.
A popular folk song was written, valorizing Jesse.
Jesse James was a lad that killed many a man. He took from the rich and gave to the poor. He'd a heart and a hand and a brain.
Whilst vilifying Ford.
It was Robert Ford, that dirty little coward. I wonder how does he feel?
And Jesse was the subject of many, many books. At the time, dime novels were a popular form of entertainment aimed primarily at young boys. They told exciting, action-packed adventure stories. Publishers like the 5-cent Wide Awake Library would release these novels on a weekly basis. In 1881, the year before Jesse's death, they published The Train Robbers, or A Story of the James Boys.
Oh, you know what I got right next to my bed? Is The Train Robbers, or A Story of the James Boys by R.W. Stevens.
It was the first dime novel to feature Jesse James as a character, and was a great success. And so the publisher would soon start to regularly produce stories about the James brothers. These novels often had very far-fetched plots where the brothers pulled off elaborate schemes.
Y'all wouldn't go believe in one of them silly dime novels, would you?
They're all lies, you know.
In the wake of Jesse's death, such novels became even more popular, and many other dime novel series would be published by a variety of authors, dedicated exclusively to the exploits of the James brothers. Jesse would soon become the dime novel's most popular subject. Kent Steckmesser writes, early issues frequently depict Jesse James as a murderous enemy of society, who deserved his death at the hands of turncoat Bob Ford. But then the writers transform him into a saintly do-gooder.
It says here that Jesse James really isn't a criminal, that he's just misunderstood. Why does he rob? Why does he plunder? He gives it all to the poor.
In this role, he is seen paying off farm mortgages.
Here's the $600. Compliments of Jesse James.
And saving young women from lustful, bad outlaws. The increasingly romanticized, heroic depictions of Jesse in part had to do with how American culture was framing the frontier's westward expansion. Stories about Jesse, thematically, fit well within the emerging genre of Western fiction, which often focused on heroes who stood outside of society and solved their problems through violence. Jesse's image even helped shape the heroic Western outlaw archetype for decades to come. As Richard Slotkin writes, some of the guerrilla hero's gifts became the hallmarks of the movie Cowboy and Gunfighter. His superb horsemanship and love for a favoured animal, and his almost fetishistic preference for the pistol as a weapon, and his preternatural skill with it. Jesse James had now transformed from an avenger of the South to a hero of the West. He was elevated to the status of a minor deity in an increasingly secular, capitalist society.
Soon, 1,000 strangers will make the spellbound pilgrimages to the cottage, or were venerating the iced remains inside Vaden's cooling room.
The United States was still a young nation, forging its identity through myth, as many nations have before. Western heroes like Jesse James became cultural touchstones, archetypes of American masculinity, a model of what every American man ought to be: rugged, self-reliant, resistant to authority.
Not you.
Around this time, cinema was beginning to establish itself as a new popular art form, and Western outlaws were among its favourite subjects. The Great Train Robbery, often wrongly asserted to be the first Western ever made, was a big success in vaudeville houses throughout America. One of the most iconic films of the era, it depicts a train robbery very similar to the kind committed by the James Younger gang. Many films about Western outlaw heroes would be made throughout the silent era, including several about Jesse himself. The James Boys of Missouri from 1908 is likely the first ever cinematic depiction of Jesse James, although the film is now lost, as are most of the films about Jesse James from that era. In 1921, 2 films were made about Jesse: Jesse James Under the Black Flag and Jesse James the Outlaw. Neither survives in its original form, but both were edited together in the 1930s, with an audio narration added, and that version survives today. The films are notable mainly because Jesse is played by his own son, Jesse James Jr. This proves to be a ludicrous casting decision early on, as Jesse Jr. was then in his 40s, trying to portray his father as a teenager. Unsurprisingly, the films are laughable propaganda.
His only desire is to become a useful and a law-abiding citizen.
Depicting Jesse James as a victim, forced into being both a guerrilla and an outlaw by unjust persecution. They even claim that Jesse was innocent of many of the crimes he was accused of, as they were committed by a worse outlaw that had framed him. As the sound era arrived, the Western dropped in popularity, and relatively few large-scale Westerns were made in the 1930s. In 1939, the genre had a major revival, with acclaimed popular successes such as Destry Rides Again, Dodge City, and Stagecoach. However, by far the biggest Western that year was none other than Jesse James. Featuring Tyrone Power in the title role and Henry Fonda as Frank James, the 1939 production of Jesse James was a smash hit. The film is notoriously historically inaccurate. Jesse's own granddaughter said, about the only connection it had with fact was that there was once a man named James and he did ride a horse. In this telling of the story, Jesse and Frank become outlaws because the evil railroad company was turning poor farmers off their land.
Railroad's gonna come right smack through your land, and there ain't a thing in the world that you can do to stop it.
In reality, the supposedly downtrodden Missouri farmers Frank and Jesse are framed as defending weren't thrown off their land by railroad barons, and in fact largely benefited from the railway lines, as they were a faster and cheaper way to transport goods to market. Richard Slotkin wrote of Jesse that, in effect, his public legend was rewritten after 1880, and his conflict with the railroad was featured at the expense of struggles that were far more germane to his career. It was this rewriting that transformed the local hero and Reconstruction outlaw into a figure of Western or frontier mythology, and the hero of a national myth of resistance. This movie represents the ultimate crystallization of that myth. Jesse is shown as the champion of the common man against the elite, the defender of tradition against modernity. The ugly truth of what that tradition really entailed is erased. The only major black character is a friendly and obedient servant of the James brothers called Pinky, who Jesse regularly barks orders at.
Never mind the supper, Pinky. We'll start right now. Pack, we're getting out of here.
Yes, sir.
Pinky presumably would have been a slave belonging to the James family before the Civil War, but that, of course, is never mentioned. The Hays Code demanded that a criminal like Jesse couldn't be an unambiguous hero, and he is gradually corrupted by paranoia and megalomania.
But the way you're going on is just like you was trying to commit suicide.
And just who do you think you are?
Now listen, Jesse.
For movie studios, the handy thing about Jesse's inevitable murder at the hands of Robert Ford is that his story can serve as a cautionary tale, preventing the film from being accused of encouraging and glorifying criminal behavior.
But that's why you gotta play outlaw. See, Jesse James has gotta die.
And yet it also redeems him and bestows upon him a sense of heroic martyrdom.
There ain't no question about it. Jesse was an outlaw, but we ain't ashamed of him. Maybe it's because he was bold and lawless, like we all of us like to be sometimes. Murdered by a traitor and coward whose name is not worthy to appear here.
Meanwhile, Robert Ford, played by John Carradine, is depicted as a coward motivated largely by greed. In this portrayal, it's him that's responsible for the Northfield robbery going wrong, even though in real life Ford wasn't even in the gang at that point in time. The 1939 Jesse James film is ultimately an incredibly well-produced piece of spectacle, with some stunts and action set pieces that hold up well even to this day. Its success helped resurrect the Western genre and spawned a slew of other films about Jesse. Just the next year in 1940, there was a sequel called The Return of Frank James, focusing on Frank's attempts to hunt down Robert Ford and his brother Charlie to avenge Jesse's murder. Robert Ford plays a larger part in this story, but again, he's depicted as a one-dimensional villain, and his main attribute is cowardice. He runs away from every single confrontation in the movie. We see him and Charlie try to cash in on their murder of Jesse by staging a reenactment of it for audiences, as happened in real life. However, in this version of events, Robert and Charlie don't shoot Jesse in the back, but instead defeat him in a gunfight in order to save a poor young woman that he's robbing.
Help! Help!
Over the next 2 decades, there would be dozens of films featuring Jesse James as a character.
Who's this kid think he is, Jesse James?
That's exactly who he is, mister.
You mean that's really
Jesse James?
He became perhaps the most ubiquitous Western hero on the silver screen. He was played by some of the most popular Western actors of the time, like Roy Rogers and Audie Murphy.
Yeah, come on, Jesse, let's go.
Many of these films are cheap, largely forgettable adventure stories. Often Jesse James is featured purely for name recognition, and the film has little to do with his life.
You must be Jesse.
Yeah.
Although occasionally the films would embrace his history as a guerrilla fighter in the Civil War.
James. Jesse?
Even though these films would often show the guerrilla's violence as barbarous, Jesse himself would usually remain a morally upstanding, romantic hero.
I'm gonna kill you for that.
You're gonna do what?
Draw your gun.
The most interesting Jesse James film from this era is Samuel Fuller's I Shot Jesse James from 1949, which centers on Robert Ford, played here by John Ireland, and provides a more sympathetic, ambivalent look at a man usually branded as an opportunistic coward.
You shot Jesse James. Anybody would shoot you becomes the biggest gunman in the country.
In the film, Ford kills Jesse because he hopes that will allow him to start a new, peaceful life with the woman he loves.
When you pulled that trigger, all the love I had for you.
But I done it for you.
Oh, say that. Don't ever say that.
Well, it's true, Cynthia.
But gradually, he comes to regret his actions. Audiences by this point would have been familiar with the particulars of Jesse's death, having already seen it restaged in other popular movies. They would know that he put his guns to one side and stood on a chair to adjust a picture, leaving him defenseless to Ford's attack. Fuller has a portrait of Jesse's mother hanging crooked in the background, looming ominously behind Jesse throughout the early scenes, so that everyone knows precisely what's going to happen. This foreshadowing makes Jesse's death feel predestined. Ford is merely enacting the will of fate. When he raises his gun and shoots Jesse, Ireland plays him as if in a daze, seemingly disconnected from his own actions. The slowness of the actor's movements and the deliberate shot composition add a sense of staginess to the moment. It feels as if we are seeing a performance, an event being restaged rather than unfolding spontaneously before our eyes. Later in the film, we will see another recreation of Jesse's death when Ford performs it for the stage, which he again acts out as if in a trance. And we see both scenes superimposed upon each other. Jesse's death is now stripped of context, reduced to a singular simple image of betrayal to be endlessly reproduced and relived. Only this time, Ford refuses to play his role. I Shot Jesse James is also widely seen as implying a homoerotic subtext to Ford's relationship with Jesse. Director Samuel Fuller claimed in an interview that Jesse was bisexual, and the film ends on Ford's admission of love for Jesse.
I'm sorry for what I done to Jess. I loved him.
Tell him it's a chance of a lifetime to get Jesse James.
One other interesting depiction of Jesse James from this period is the 1957 film The True Story of Jesse James by Nicholas Ray, the director of Rebel Without a Cause and Johnny Guitar. The film was intended as a remake of the 1939 Jesse James, and directly recreates several of that film's most iconic moments. In fact, in several cases, the film actually reuses footage from the original Jesse James, reframing it to its CinemaScope format. However, rather than tell the story in a linear fashion as the 1939 film did, It presents a series of flashbacks from various characters' perspectives. Nicholas Ray apparently wanted the film to be more Brechtian in style, drawing very explicit attention to the story's status as an untrustworthy recreation of events. This, of course, was far too experimental to be allowed by studio executives. Those executives would take the film away from Ray, recutting it and adding one of the more ridiculous transitions in film history to all the flashbacks.
I know what happened that night.
It's possible Ray had intended a Rashomon effect, where we are left doubting all of the narrators, but in the final film, aside from the non-linearity, we are left with a fairly conventional retelling of the 1939 Jesse James' story. There's actually more reactionary than many of the depictions that came before.
This man has always hated real Southerners.
I never did hold with slavers.
We never owned a slave.
Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying? Oh my God, stop fucking lying.
In the 60s and 70s, Western movies suffered something of a decline, commercially if not artistically. As such, Jesse James no longer held as central a place in American popular culture, although his name was still synonymous in the minds of audiences with the archetypal Western outlaw.
Why, it's Jesse James! Put him down, this one's on me.
Portrayals of Jesse became sillier. He met Frankenstein's daughter in a double feature where Billy the Kid fought Dracula, arguably getting the better end of the deal. And he appeared with a variety of Western heroes in the Three Stooges' final film, The Outlaws is Coming.
That's more!
Jesse would also be featured on numerous episodes of television, including guest spots on The Twilight Zone, Little House on the Prairie, The Brady Bunch, and Dukes of Hazzard. In this era, there was also the emergence of the so-called Revisionist Western, films that set out to explicitly critique and subvert the myths established by the Westerns of decades prior. Western heroes like Billy the Kid, General Custer, and Buffalo Bill Cody, who'd had many classic Westerns made about them, lauding their deeds, were now being portrayed by directors like Sam Peckinpah, Arthur Penn, and Robert Altman as dishonorable, delusional, and exploitative. One such film was made about Jesse James in 1972, The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid by Philip Kaufman. The film starts with a voiceover, talking about the James Younger Gang in grandiose terms.
They were the greatest revolver fighters, the greatest train, stagecoach, and bank robbers that ever lived.
But will go on to skewer and undermine that myth. We are properly introduced to Jesse whilst he's taking a shit. He's played by Robert Duvall, who seems quite deliberately to be giving a performance devoid of any charm. This Jesse is a brutal, racist, idiotic sociopath, who seems to be drawn to the outlaw life more for the killing than the money. He uses his claimed loyalty to the Southern cause to justify his crimes, but ultimately he's nothing but a nihilist, driven by pure ego.
There's a lesson for you, Bob. No one should be able to identify a guerrilla in enemy country.
In addition to critiquing and subverting the myths and narratives of earlier Westerns, the revisionist films of this era started to take on a different tone. They became more melancholic and reflective. Increasingly, they focused on older characters, or sometimes just cast old actors to play younger ones. In these films, there's a sense of looking back on an era that has now passed.
Times have changed.
Times, maybe. Not me.
The characters themselves seem stuck out of time, living in a world that has moved on without them. Their violence may have helped build this society, but they are no longer needed within it. In 1980, another take on the James Younger Gang was released, The Long Riders by Walter Hill, a film famous for having had the various sets of brothers who made up the gang played by real-life siblings.
David, Keith, and Robert Carradine as Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger. James and Stacy Keach as Jesse and Frank James.
Rather than being a Jesse James biopic, it is much more of an ensemble piece, focusing on the entire gang. The film isn't especially revisionist to start with. Mostly it's an action movie. As with most of Hill's work, the violence is shot and edited in an incredibly striking, visceral manner. There are several moments where Hill seems to be restaging scenes from earlier Jesse James films, in some cases even using the exact same shot compositions. Again, we are getting the sense of events being restaged or reenacted in some way. The film's tone changes in the scene where it depicts the Northfield robbery, which for me is among the best action set pieces in the history of American cinema. As the sequence continues, the sound design becomes more heightened and surreal. The cross-cutting becomes more erratic, and the use of slow motion more excessive. This brutal, disquieting intensity reframes the entire rest of the film, not as an adventure story, but as a death march towards a grim and inevitable fate.
You know who you're talking to? You know what kind of men sprung out of Missouri? Jameses, Youngers, Clantons, Earps, and now Bob and Charlie Ford.
Here Robert and Charlie Ford are presented as glory hunters, hoping that killing Jesse James will establish them as equally legendary.
I shot Jesse James.
In The Long Rider's final stages, Ry Cooder's great soundtrack becomes more elegiac. The film's very final shot turns to monochrome before fading to black. What was once the present has become consigned to memory and history.
If you tell me there's a time lock on that vault, they'll be mopping up your brains for a week. Open it.
As the Western genre further declined, there were very few major screen portrayals of Jesse James over the next few decades. He appeared mostly in lower-budget, made-for-TV movies. In 2001, a Colin Farrell star vehicle was made about the James Gang, called American Outlaws. It was incredibly inaccurate, even by the standards of Jesse James films, and was largely derided by critics. By this point, audiences were less familiar with the details of the Jesse James story, to a point where it's no longer even necessary to kill him at the end, and he can ride off into the sunset. In life, Jesse James willfully constructed a myth around himself. With the help of John Newman Edwards, he effectively mounted a modern PR campaign to cast himself as a heroic, noble Robin Hood figure, fighting to avenge the South and maintain its dignity. And he was wildly successful in his myth-making. However, myths have a habit of taking on lives of their own, and over the many decades since his death, the story of Jesse James has been retold and reshaped to suit both the needs of the teller and the audience. Jesse has become an archetypal figure, stripped of geography and politics, stripped of the twisted racist ideals that the man himself was trying to promote. The name Jesse James is now simply synonymous with the word outlaw. He became an abstract ideal, a part of the collective unconscious, a figure on the American dreamscape. Generations of men and boys would read dime novels and watch westerns about Jesse James, living vicariously through him, imagining themselves in his place, aspiring to a life of adventure, longing to be free of society's restrictions.
Please don't shoot me, Mr. James. Just give me your money, lady.
The existence of the man himself, the historical figure Jesse James, with his wanton brutality and inconvenient politics, was an impediment to the myth. He needed to be erased. In killing the man, Robert Ford helped foster the legend. The ghost of Jesse James, the spirit that lived on in our collective consciousness after his death, would go on to be far more powerful and influential than the man himself ever was. Robert Ford, meanwhile, would only ever be remembered in relation to Jesse James. He never became a legend in his own right. The words coward and traitor that haunted him throughout his later life would continue to follow him into death. Almost a century later, his name was still being used as a metaphor for betrayal.
And I feel like a bullet in the gun of a Robert Ford. I'm low as a paid assassin is, you know I'm cold as a hired sword.
Jesse James and Robert Ford were once real human beings with complex inner lives, but they are dead and gone, inaccessible to us now. History and myth have created out of their lives two archetypal figures, the heroic outlaw and the treacherous coward, and bestowed upon them a kind of immortality. They live with us still. This video is not over yet. If you want to watch the next part, the link is in the description below and should be on screen right now. There's also a playlist which has all of the different parts of the video together. Also, if you want to watch the whole thing in one go, the full version is available on Patreon. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank my patrons, Tim Richardson, Patrick Ellis, and Kenneth Terrell. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next part.